once again welcome everyone and say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. So this session will be recorded and it's being live streamed. So if you do press the button that has come on your screen, that means you're accepting to stay with us for the next couple of, for the hour and a half, where we will dive into the Global Compact for Migration webinar series, which we started off last year as part of the Global Compact for Migration certificate program that is being offered by 4 organizations. It's the second time we are in this journey, and we're really glad that partners of the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, and that is where I am coming from, as well as the International Institute for Migration and Development, the Metropolis Asia Pacific, the Migrant Forum in Asia, as well as the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants. And these 4 organizations have been running this certificate program since we kicked off in September. We have managed to cover a wide range of issues that are covered between 10 objectives, and we're really happy today that we have the opportunity to once again just to dive into some different elements. And so today we'll be looking at Global Compact for Migration objective number 11 and 12 that talk about managing borders as well as screening and referral. And we thought as an opportunity to catch up, but also as an opportunity to show the interconnection between Global Compact for Migration objectives. These 2 objectives would go hand in hand and actually impact on each other. I think we have been able to see that in the last couple of webinars that we have had. We've also been able to see that demonstration in some of the lectures that have taken place every Saturday since we started the certificate program. And you can watch all the videos and all the lecture series on GRFDT YouTube channel to catch up with us on that. So what is covered under GCM 11? So GCM 11 calls on states to manage borders in an integrated, secure, and coordinated manner. And the text reads that we commit to manage our national borders in a coordinated manner, promoting bilateral and regional cooperation, ensuring security for states, communities, and migrants, and facilitating safe, regular cross-border movements of people while preventing irregular migration. We further commit to implement border management policies that respect national sovereignty, the rule of law, obligations under international law, human rights of all migrants, regardless of the migration status, and are non-discriminatory, gender-responsive, and child-sensitive. So quite some ambitious goals there. And Global Compact for Migration 12, because I think it's important to remind ourselves where we're centered, calls on states to strengthen certainty, predictability in migration procedures for appropriate screening, assessment, and referral. And the text reads, and we only just read the commitment as usual, we commit to increase legal certainty and predictability of migration procedures by developing and strengthening effective and human rights-based mechanisms for adequate and timely screening and individual assessment of all migrants for the purpose of identifying and facilitating access to the appropriate referral procedures in accordance with international law. So we can see that both compacts make reference to best practice at the international level, and they're making reference to international law. We can also see the emphasis on a human rights-based approach, which I think, as we have heard in the last webinars, but also as we hear in the migration governance space, how we really should look more to the human rights aspects of migration. I mean, I think often we're talking about migrants' rights as though they were different from other human beings. So I think that emphasis comes out to us. I think there's also a diverse group that's been called for in both in terms of the levels of cooperation that go into whether it's screening or that go into management of borders and sort of what is really involved. Now, the beauty of having a panel is that I don't have to spend time talking to you about GCM 11 and 12. And therefore, I'm really delighted that we have a stellar panel today. So let me introduce to you Kudakwashe Vanyoro, who is a postdoctorate research fellow at the African Center for Migration and Society. And then we have Chloe Powers, who is at the Border Violence Monitoring Network, and James Chapman, who's the head of advocacy and legal advisor for the Scalabrini Center of Cape Town. To our dear panelists, you are welcome and thank you for joining us. I'll be giving and sharing their bios as we go along. Just to kick off the conversation, a bit of housekeeping. It's always good to see people on their videos because we haven't seen each other in pre-pandemic and maybe even post-pandemic times for others. So it's always nice to see people. So feel free to turn on your videos if your bandwidth allows it. But we just ask you to have your microphones muted for the rest of the conversation so we are able to follow closely. And you are free and welcome to share in the chat. In the first couple of minutes, it's nice to know where you're coming from. And after that, please feel free to share your reflections, your questions, and also just, you know, what's new and what you think, what triggers your thinking as the panelists would be sharing on the various issues. So we'll kick off with Kuda. And Kuda, putting you on the spot there, but before, you know, as you are muting your mic, let me just introduce Kuda Kwashe to you. So Kuda is a postgraduate research fellow at the African Center for Migration and Society, which is based at the University of Witwatersrand. This word has always been a tongue twister for me coming from Zambia. We always wondered how to pronounce that. So we'll hear it from Kuda. And it's in South Africa. And Kuda has been working around migration, temporality, borders, humanitarianism, and governance in Africa. And he has also covered aspects of migration and health systems. At the institution that he is working for, he has had a particular focus on looking at Zimbabwe and South Africa, as well as some of the issues that are related to medical xenophobia, referral, and harmonization of treatment protocols. I think Kuda's thesis is quite interesting, and I had the pleasure of, you know, having had to have an interview with him as part of a research where he explored temporal disruptions at international borders that shape immobile and mobile bodies, experiences, and modes of waiting by focusing on irregular Zimbabwean migrant men at the Zimbabwe-South Africa border who arrived in South Africa and are therefore restricted to moving further into the country. So quite a very in-depth study there, and we'll be hearing some of the work that Kuda has done around this in the context of what we are covering under the GCM objectives that we have here. And Kuda is a writer, so he's written a book on governing immobilities on the same topic, and as well as written a couple of other pieces that look at, for instance, decolonizing migration research. And he is responsible at the institution for stakeholder engagement in South Africa, working together with decision makers, not only in government, but in civil society, in order to make sure that there's much more evidence that's accessible and applicable as decisions are being made on migration governance. So a fully packed introduction there, Kuda, and I wondered that maybe you could just, you know, I think we're all a little bit shaken up after the holidays. If you could just situate for us, you know, the issues that are related to border management in South Africa with the view of the Zimbabwe-South Africa perspective. I mean, we've always known over the years, for those who live in Southern Africa, that these two countries, I would say, are sort of the bread basket. Zimbabwe and Zambia, Zimbabwe and South Africa would be sort of the bread baskets of Southern Africa. And they've commonly seem to have shared very good relations with, you know, visa regimes that were relatively quite open, where migrants and mobility seem to have been better managed, and was very much on a demand-based point of view. So it was not very uncommon to sort of see Zimbabwean migrants working in the service sector, but also working in other sectors within South Africa. And then something has happened over the years with the post-crisis as well, but also with the high volumes of migrants, of people rather seeking livelihoods, not just from Zimbabwe, but from other parts of the world, but of course, using Zimbabwean borders and also coming in through South Africa in that way. So we just wanted maybe for you to situate for us what that border management kind of really looks like by zooming us in a bit more on what life is like for migrants at Musina.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Patty, for that. So yeah, like you rightly said, I think the Zimbabwe-South Africa border in Southern Africa is a very interesting case, not only because of its history, which really has to do with labor migration, but also because of the developments that have taken place over the the past I'm trying to count to as far back as the Zimbabwean crisis, whether it's been a decade or more, possibly more by now. So in that sense, the Zimbabwe, I think it's, for those of us who don't know, I mean, I think it's synonymous with sort of Robert Mugabe, who was the president at the time, who through his governance in 2008 oversaw a crisis that got out of hand economically and politically, which forced thousands of migrants to move and to be displaced. So in this sense, we see the sort of displacement that takes place as a result of, I think that the migration profile itself is complicated in the sense that people are moving for politically induced economic reasons. So they move as, South African state would label them as sort of economic migrants, whereas they would come to South Africa to apply for asylum, which is particularly because of the perception, I think, of their own experiences when you talk to them, even to migrants until now, will say to you, there's in as much as there's no war, I spoke to someone who would say there's a Cold War in Zimbabwe, speaking sort of to the ideological contestations that have shaped that crisis. So that is the one aspect that makes up that particular border. The second aspect has to do with, which is what it becomes a space for mixed migration flows, is the regular and high irregular migration over a space that has sort of 22 unofficial entry points. The economic activities happening there, the smuggling that comes with the lack of documentation on the part of Zimbabweans who can sometimes don't have passports, or most of the times because of the cost of the passports and also the bureaucratic delays, and also people who do have passports but cannot necessarily get permits would then have to move with a visitor visa. So there's that aspect to it that has to do with informal kind of mobilities, but also there's also the aspect to do with asylum seekers. For Zimbabwe is also a transit country for people from the DRC or who transit through Zambia or Mozambique, then come in to Zimbabwe headed to South Africa. The same applies for migrants who move from the Horn, including Ethiopia, Somalia, and Tanzania, who move through Zambia and Malawi to get into South Africa. So this makes the Beitbridge border the busiest inland port of entry in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has also made that situation all worse, with the monitoring that has to take place, the screening that has to take place, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's currently, as we speak, the context is situated within that broader context of sort of crisis, mixed migration, transit, as well as COVID-19 crisis, which has made life a little bit more difficult for people, and also slowed down the processing of people in that space. I think last year, there's reports that 15 people died in that border while waiting to be processed, and of course, that also ranks. I think the informality is also heightened by the building of a border fence that has taken place. And also my work looks at the humanitarian influx in 2008, but how that humanitarianism is also being drawn away because of sort of some of the perceptions of there's a geopolitical thing happening where Zimbabweans are not necessarily perceived as sort of asylum seekers, which has always existed, but has become more legitimized and reinforced because of the perception that the new government is somewhat a little bit different, as they call themselves, a new dispensation. So to wrap up, we are also seeing an internal kind of bordering where the Zimbabwe special permits that were allocated to address this nexus between the economic and political displacement are also starting to be pulled away from Zimbabweans. So the protection is getting lesser and lesser. So it's not only the physical borders, but also we're seeing internally how the livelihoods and protection of migrants from Zimbabwe are quite contested.
Thanks, Kuda. And I just wondered when we spoke, I think it was really interesting for us to sort of see the disconnect that we have. So we have this global compact that promises, or that countries commit to rather, and then from either side. I think where in many African countries, we're also seeing where one-stop border posts had also seemed to facilitate migration. There's sort of these many examples of where the border should be a space that opens up for migrants to find their way and be adequately processed according to the need that they present. But of course, as we know with immigration practice around the world, that there has been, traditionally, and I think embedded into immigration law and immigration legislation, that it comes from a protection point of view. It's about protecting the interests and security for the nation, rather than having sort of this open approach. And then when you have mixed migration flows, as you've explained for Zimbabwe, it becomes that the system is actually not ready to accommodate the different types of needs that it faces. So of course, you've also talked about some of the vulnerabilities that that you sort of then foresee for migrants, particularly in mixed migration flows, which is the flows that we're seeing, I think, that are becoming sort of the normal. Particularly also after COVID, even in spaces where we didn't expect them. And we'll also hear a bit from Chloe how that has translated in the European space, for instance, and in the Balkans, rather, more specific. So maybe could I just, when we talk about, and I think you can relate to some of the projects that you're working on, when we talk about vulnerability in the context of the GCM, how is it dealt with, and how does it then touch on what we're sort of seeing as current pushbacks, if we could call them that, and sort of these immigration amendments and border management bills that come out that are not really having a humanitarian face that migrants expect, particularly those who are running to borders because they're seeking international protection.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the first of all, I think the one issue with the vulnerability aspect has to do with the essentialization that comes with the global migration regime itself, which is the very foundation of the global compact for migrants and refugees. I was privileged enough to have been part of the Global Forum for Migration on Migration and Development during the formative stages of the compact. And one of the key concerns that was raised was the binary or the categorization between migrants and refugees, and whether that actually would serve the very interests of migrants and refugees to begin with. So there is this fundamental problem that is not necessarily something that scholars talk about, but within civil society itself, about whether these categories pay sufficient attention to the realities of migrants. So on the one hand, you see the migration and development discourse then becoming the win-win-win agenda that actually got the GCMs going, to be something we could actually have. So it was a way to get the buy-in from states, but at the same time, you get the sort of People's Global Alliance who would come in with a more rights-based approach and say, why are you, they would protest even outside the GFMD's sessions I think quite routinely or perennially to say, there's a lot of commodification happening here. But that was, I think, the dilemma in trying to get to these compacts in the first place. One had to, in as much as it was a great win, the bargain had to be made by presenting migrants in a certain way, which implicitly would then suggest that, for example, in the context of South Africa, that refugees are something else. And this is where we see the GCM, whether it intends to do so or not, providing some ammunition for or legitimizing pre-existing things we've been seeing already, at least in South Africa, and perhaps providing new language as well in different parts of Africa where this would not have been the case, to talk about refugees as, in the language of sort of burden sharing, and in the language of, I think, the undercutting of the refugee regime which I think the Scalabrini has been kind of contesting with the refugee amendments that are currently, I think, and I think James would be better equipped to talk about where these things are legally. But these are some of the reasons why it almost sounds natural and acceptable to say, refugees are only about protection. They're not about bringing any kind of development. We can cut away their right to work or their right to study because they're dependent on us as a state. We'll go down into some of the issues talking. I think the issues of gender are also important things to pay attention to. What is the typical refugee? Who is this suffering individual, and who is this agentive migrant? And these are some of the issues that then trickle down to, at the border at least, the kinds of politics we see when it comes to protection. When transit shelters are built, they're built on grounds of gender, and there's all micropolitics around how that disadvantages or reinforces certain stereotypes related to trafficking, for example, for women, where they come to be seen in a particular light, whereas men are also seen in a light that also presupposes certain aspects of resilience, and also ties them away from anything to do with, the possibility that they may move with children, or they may be actual caregivers, et cetera, et cetera. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing in those reflections, Good. And I think we'll come back to you to, to just get a sense from some of the projects that you're doing now, kind of that have had this post-COVID look, and also the pre-COVID look in terms of vulnerabilities and how those differences are, because one of the things that we like to emphasize is that there is an interconnection, there is a connection and interconnection as well between all the various objectives of the Global Compact. And so we cannot really look at them in silos. So I think you've brought out some really interesting aspects in terms of talking about gender, in terms of talking about vulnerability and how that relates to age. It makes me think immediately of the very first objective that looks to data, for instance, and how I guess that is even captured, and how data then is used to inform actual decisions around provision of services, and also actual decisions in relation to what migration policy should actually speak to, and immigration policy should actually speak to, and therefore have border management be informed by it. And maybe we can come back to you on that one. And also, as always, we always like to speak about, legal pathways, obviously, as an essential, as a cornerstone objective, something that we have, that has been coined around the conversations in these spaces as well, where we're seeing a lack of legal pathways, even though, for instance, at the African Union level, at the African continent, there's ambitions of sort of freely opening up all the 54, 55 territories, as one would have, of free mobility, but still we have a lot of visa regimes, and we still have a lot of restrictions for people to be able to move around, and countries maintaining this sovereignty, which is obviously explained in the objectives. But thanks a lot for sharing on this, and we'll be coming back to you on those particular questions if you could reflect on them. Now, I was going to move again and speak into another region, but I think maybe it's a good opportunity for us to just bring in James very briefly here, because there's something that Kuda has mentioned in terms of the language that we have, the categorization and the definitions that we assign to migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, those needing international protection, and so on, and how those kind of definitions provide that level of access. Another Global Compact for Migration objective that is there. And James, I will give James's bio in a minute, and I thought that for us, maybe you could also just speak to us a bit about how you because we would like to hear from you some of the work that Scalabrini Center and the advocacy work that you do there. And I think it would be great to get kind of insights into what we see as barriers, or what we see as access in terms of procedures and services for migrants, and as well as asylum seekers, and particularly linked to what Kuda had just talked about, and how that links up all to kind of border management. The fact that you are defined in a certain way and the language defines you in a certain way that gives you access to certain things, regardless of the vulnerability that you expose as an individual and as a human being. So James, I wonder if you could just give us a quick reflection on that, and I'll be introducing you in a moment after that response.
Great. Thank you very much for that, and Paddy, and also to Kuda speaking to the Scalabrini Center. So I think that maybe starting with where Kuda left off in terms of that distinction between asylum seekers and refugees on the one hand and other migrant groups, because there is historically a kind of additional protection and safeguarding to your category of asylum seekers and refugees, because they're people who either have fled because of a well-founded fear of persecution based on enumerated grounds, or people who have left because of, in terms of the extended definition, the 1969 African Union Convention definition, because of events seriously disturbing, disrupting foreign occupation. And so, I mean, you're dealing with a particularly vulnerable group, but I think that the gap or the problem that you might fall into is the emphasis or the focusing on refugees and asylum seekers sometimes means that we don't provide the same human rights, the same protection, the same acknowledgement of the dignity, the equality of other migrant groups. And it seems to be as though, you know, we try to limit the number of people who fall within this very small definition, interpreted narrowly, and do not make proper provision for safe, dignified, rights-protecting migration, safe and orderly migration. Coming to some of the work that the Scalabrini Center does, I also just wanted to mention that I joined the Scalabrini Center fairly recently, about a week ago, but I've been working with the Scalabrini Institute for Human Mobility in Africa, which is the sister organization, a research institute. In any case, I mean, the Scalabrini Center has made commitments with respect to the compacts, particularly the compact with respect to refugees, constantly and consistently engages with government in sort of medium and high level advocacy, and that includes, for instance, the Border Management Authority Act, the one-stop border post legislation, the regulations. We did engage with respect to ZDP's, Zimbabwean dispensation permits, Zimbabwean special permits. They've done a lot of work with respect to Angolan special permit holders. So in South Africa, there's like, and I could have mentioned the Zimbabwean exemption permits, which visas, which are well, special permits, which are being taken away, stripped as of the end of last year. And these are all sort of particular groups that, you know, to enhance that kind of idea and vision of having free and open borders and in greater mobility, some special permits kind of allowed for that, and allowed for maybe sort of low skilled, less requirements, but those being taken away kind of relates to the trend and the challenge that we've been experiencing, where kind of your developmental human rights protection kind of space seems to be shrinking as the law sort of amended, and there's a big movement towards securitization, and whether it's seen physically as could have mentioned with the establishment of a fence at the border, or whether you see it through legislation, and it's not. I mean, the refugee legislation had a major overhaul, a major amendment, but there also have been periodic amendments to the Immigration Act, and then there's your border authority legislation, your border post legislation. So all of this kind of, one would hope that the movement by the South African government and in the region would be towards sort of more open borders, and that where you're talking about the management and coordination of migration, that one doesn't lose sight of the dignity, the humanity of migrants, and that's migrants across the board, not just specifically asylum seekers and refugees, and making the distinction as often one falls into that gap. In terms of the challenges beyond that's definitional, and sorry that was a little long-winded, it's also the challenge of the compact not really sort of being binding and having maybe the teeth that other instruments have. There's, as I said, there seems to be a shift towards securitization and sovereignty. There's also challenges and difficulties with cross-border management and coordination. We see that at various levels, including sort of coordination with respect to children, where the government of Zimbabwe might follow one set of standard operating procedures, and the Eswatini government another, the South African government another, and the systems don't speak so well to one another, which means that you might have, for instance, the Department of Social Development involved with respect at one stage, and then it goes to law enforcement, and then the authorities on the other side are not aware when children are returned. There's kind of the system. One of the challenges is the systems don't speak so well to one another. There's also a difficulty coming from the civil society organizations, faith-based organizations as well, perspective that the effectiveness of engagement is a bit of a challenge, because sometimes, and you can see that regrettably with a lot of the legislation that has had to be entered into against the department with respect to migration issues, that judgments are ignored. They're not abided by. I mean, we had amendments to legislation which we made extensive submissions, and then despite that, very restrictive, narrowing, and not in line with the conventions, legislation was promulgated. And so, one of the things that you could have mentioned a few moments ago, we are currently involved in litigation, particularly with respect to the timing out of refugee claims, such that if you didn't extend your document, which there's huge problems of access, within a month, then your claim could time out. And so that's something that is subject to challenge, and as an interim interdict, and it's going to be before the court in April. So that's sub judice. It will come before the court and to be addressed. There's also, I mean, another challenge is kind of political will. There needs to be better sort of regional coordination. As I say, where we were hoping for and looking for a genuine commitment by SADC to sort of more open borders and free movement, there seems to be a sort of halting and resting on things like needing to have a fully electronic database of all citizens. There was the extension of birth certificates to requiring unabridged birth certificates, which is a whole topic, but it also has impacted on migration. I'm sure there's more, but I'll leave it there for now.
James, thank you for just zeroing in and adding your context and your perspective to what Kuda has shared on border management, and I think that's relatively important. I think when you talk about regional cooperation and just cross-border cooperation, we can see that while there's been a lot of resources and there's been a lot of kind of talk, if we say, about wishing for this kind of cooperation through different mechanisms. You talked about SADC. I also know that in Southern Africa you've got other countries that are engaged with COMESA, and then there's I think we have better examples of coordination in the East African community, for instance, where we've seen sort of a much more much more effective engagement, even at the national level, and whereas the other regional organizations, and maybe the same could be said of the East African community, the same could be said of ECOWAS, for instance, where you sort of see this real move towards a free movement of persons and what actually that spells out to. Of course, there's still quite a lot of challenges, but I think that we do have these regional organizations where there's been a lot of talk for a very long time, and migrants are not really feeling it on the ground in terms of what cross-border cooperation means. And I think you brought out a very important point related to data and why we capture data, because I think sometimes it's become much more routine that administrations capture data, but is it really being used for decision making? That is something different. And it's a pity also to hear about that shrinking space for civil society in terms of influencing policy and legislation at the national level, and this sort of restrictive space that is there. And I think it's something that one would say you're seeing in different parts of the continent as well, and also in many parts in a different way. So this shrinking space of civil society and non-state actor engagement in terms of influencing policy. But thanks again for sharing these reflections, and I will be bringing you back in when we try to just unpack a little bit GCM 12, because I think we would like you to take a bit of a deeper dive into some of the different issues there. Chloe, I think it would be really nice for us to also just hear on on the border management side, to just hear from you from the border violence monitoring network. And it's really, I think it's really been interesting to sort of to see different developments, I think, around the region, in the Balkans, but also to see how that influences in parts that are closer to the Balkans. And so as way of introduction, Chloe Powers is a researcher and an activist on borders and migration, and she lives in Greece, and she's the coordinator of Border Violence Monitoring Network, which documents violence against people on the move in the Balkans and in the Eastern Mediterranean. I was just saying to Chloe when we had the conversation earlier on that sometimes it's difficult to situate the Balkans, and I am in the Balkans, so now I have a good idea of what the Balkans are. And often when I do say to people I'm in the Balkans, they say to me, are you then in Eastern Europe, or are you in the Middle East? Are you in the Mediterranean? So I think it would be interesting, Chloe, even as you come on, for you to just zoom us in and remind us and position us. And even as you are, positioning us, I think it would be interesting for us to hear about some of the work in terms of borders and border management. I think we have heard that you are, the network is really grassroots based. So would like to hear a little bit more about that and kind of the support services that you're offering to migrants, but maybe just situate us, take us into this space and understand the type of migrants we're talking about, and also who is moving, the kind of vulnerabilities that we sort of foresee, as well as hearing a bit more about the research and advocacy work that allows you to be here with us. Chloe.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And thank you to the two previous speakers. I think there are a lot of themes that actually resonate quite heavily with the realities we encounter here in the Balkans. So maybe just to introduce a little bit first, the Border Violence Monitoring Network. We're an independent network of NGOs and small grassroots associations in the Balkans and Greece, or the Eastern Mediterranean, including Turkey, that monitors human rights violations on the external borders of the European Union and advocates to stop violence exerted against people on the move, people in transit throughout the region. BVMN was founded in 2016 when several small projects that were active in different capacities throughout the region, providing direct support to people that were transiting the different Balkan routes, starting in Greece and Turkey and trying to move into Northern Europe. And basically these small projects started hearing testimonies of violent pushbacks, right? So illegal forced deportations where without any kind of due process, state authorities were taking people and pushing them over national borders into other countries. And from there, the network has grown in terms of building a common framework for reporting on instances of pushbacks, so these legal deportations, and reporting on other forms of systemic human rights violations against people on the move. To give a little bit of contextual information about the region itself, since 2014, but even earlier, the Balkans has experienced a large increase in terms of people trying to come through this region, mainly with destinations in Northern and Western Europe. In the early years, there was it was somewhat easier in some ways for people to be in transit and to be moving throughout this route. There were kind of famous moments, for example, in 2015, when there was actually a formalized corridor created, allowing people to transit through the region and move through fairly quickly. This changed quite dramatically in 2016 with the implementation of border fences, increased militarization and securitization of borders throughout the region to get us to the point where we are now, where to transit through the region can take people years at this point. And people often experience multiple pushbacks where they're kind of stuck in a sort of limbo in states throughout the region for months, if not years at a time, and the continued kind of process of trying to reach other parts of Europe and their destinations. Yeah, so basically the work of the network has been to document human rights violations that have been occurring in this region in the last years, and to see what can be done both in the analytical sense of building up a basis of research to create a platform where people who are experiencing these human rights violations can share their own stories, but then also to engage in advocacy work on national, EU, and UN levels. And this takes kind of different forms at times. It comes down to sharing policy analyses and recommendations in the European Parliament and other kind of such interventions on a national level, engaging with UN mechanisms to try to bring this topic of pushbacks to the table, and kind of similar things like this. In addition to this, each member project engages in direct support in potentially different ways throughout the region. This ranges from direct support in terms of food, housing, these sorts of things, as well as legal information and direct kind of legal support to people that are seeking to access asylum. Maybe to touch on a couple other points that were brought up by the other panelists. One second. In terms of, sorry, this binary that we see between who are considered to be migrants and who are considered to be refugees. This is something that's in a context where access to legal pathways for migration are already so limited. It has become very, very kind of charged in some ways. Within the last year, there's been also an increasing restriction on access to asylum, with the imposition of a list of what are considered safe countries of origin. So for example, in Greece, where most of the people that are arriving here are from Afghanistan, Syria, for example, Somalia, these countries have now been designated safe countries of origin. So these people are, in essence, just like unable to access asylum as their country of origin is considered to be not high risk. And this coming at the same time, for example, as the unfolding situation in Afghanistan earlier this fall and the ongoing conflict in Syria seems kind of paradoxical to say the least. In addition to this, in terms of like the actual structural or practical side of accessing services, accessing asylum in Greece, at least on the mainland in Greece, no one has been able to access the process to register for asylum since the 22nd of November of last year. The previous system that was created where people would register via Skype was shut down, and there's been nothing to replace it. So in effect, the ability to actually apply for asylum in Greece has been suspended now for almost 3 months. So yeah, this is kind of the situation that we've been kind of struggling with here in the Balkans. I'm happy to kind of answer more specific questions after if there's something with this, and yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah. Chloe, thank you for sharing those insights. I'm just, I'm triggered to wonder what kind of vulnerabilities, and I mean, I actually don't like the word vulnerabilities because it's kind of loaded with a lot of different things. I think it's to talk about some of the difficulties, because this is what it really is, the difficulties, but also the experiences that migrants would go through. I mean, you're saying that since November of last year, there is just no possibility to apply for asylum, for asylum. And that when the system remains suspended, and we have also heard before in previous webinars where even though the European Union seems to have this common procedure for asylum application, but there are like 27 ways to get there, 27 paths, and you've got to be a rock scientist to actually also understand what that means, and what your rights would be. And so I'm just also wondering, from the work of you engaging with some of the migrants, I mean, what are those coping mechanisms that you sort of see in the wait? What's really then happening? Is there really a space for, where's the, even for humanitarian actors, where is that action? And we also understand that there's a shrinking space of how you could assist migrants in these particular spaces. Could you just tell us a little bit more?
Right. That's a really good question. I think if you look at, I would say, the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a couple major shifts in this regard in terms of both kind of the increasing restrictions on mobility, and so people being in these kind of spaces of transit for months, if not years at a time, but then also the shrinking of different support structures available. And this has come kind of in 2 parts, right? So part of it is the shrinking space for civil society and the increasing criminalization actually of solidarity initiatives, where there's, in Greece in particular, but as also in Bosnia and Serbia and Croatia, there have been new forms of legislation passed that limit the potential for civil society actors to be involved, and increasing restrictions on the work that they do, which practically speaking has led to a lot of projects shutting down, to a decrease in support that is available for people that are applying for asylum, that are stuck in kind of these spaces while waiting. In addition to this, there's been major changes in terms of state management of migration. To speak about the situation in Greece again, the kind of administration of refugee camps and of the asylum procedure in Greece recently shifted from a system that heavily involved UNHCR and kind of other international actors to one that is entirely run by the Greek Ministry of Migration. There's been a shift towards creating closed camps. So whereas before, refugee camps were spaces that people could come in and go fairly freely, people didn't have to live there. If they were seeking asylum, they could also, for example, rent an apartment in town or be housed in other facilities. Now, increasingly, there's a push to have all people that are seeking asylum residing in specific refugee camps that are geographically isolated, far from major urban centers, with strict curfews and heavy surveillance inside, that keep them completely isolated from the rest of the population and go against any kind of logic that would focus on, for example, the integration of these populations into society. In addition to this, other forms of support that previously were available, such as cash assistance or medical support, have been scaled back drastically in the last couple of years to create a situation where people become entirely dependent on these camp structures and isolated from the rest of the society and from urban centers in general. In terms of vulnerability and how people are dealing with this was a huge topic, for example, in the islands in the last years. Whereas, I mean, to give the example of kind of the infamous Moria camp and everything that happened after the fire last year, where the camp actually burned down, there were open letters coming from MSF and other actors in the island that what we were seeing was a mental health emergency in some ways, of people losing hope and being so kind of stuck within these spaces of where they were essentially detained. And the very drastic impact that had on people's health and well-being. So yeah, it's a situation that is shifting quite quickly and in ways that are quite concerning for civil society actors, and it's unclear at the moment how things will go in the coming years and months.
That's thank you for sharing that, and I'm just thinking about some of the things that actually Kuda has had also alluded to in terms of when I look back then at this management of borders in an integrated, secure, coordinated manner, I think it's really not from the perspective of what can we do better for the migrant in front of us from a humanitarian point of view, and we sort of still go back into really questioning how do we really decolonize. I think if that's the word, these migration policies and legislation that sort of guide practices, and that sort of also give the government machinery whether to open the door, to keep that door closed. And then let's talk about irregular migration and corruption, and what that has meant in particular spaces when migrants are stuck. or where you have border jumpers, for instance, Nokuda in Southern Africa, I think in South Africa, as you have said, but also in different parts of Southern Africa, as migrants are moving from the Horn of Africa all the way down, and the role that traffickers and smugglers are actually being equipped by the lack of coordination by actors to provide a much more humanitarian way, of course, ensuring security, but having a bit of an eye to what the humanitarian aspects or the humanitarian needs that migrants or people on the move would have. So thanks again, Chloe, for sharing these. James, we want to let's bring in James and come to GCM 12 here, where we you know, the procedures in migration for the screening and the assessment, and maybe you can zoom in a bit to what you sort of see and the experiences that you have vis-a-vis the legislations that are there and the needs that the migrants have, James, through Scalabrini Center. And I know you've said that you've just been there for a couple of weeks, so we're also happy to get links and shares to some web pages. I think we're also very happy to share with some of our participants here to sort of see the kind of work that's going on, because one of the things that has been highlighted, even though it's not in GCM 12, is to sort of have this gender sensitive, this child sensitive approach. So where we're actually looking at migrants for who they are and saying, this is a child, this is an unaccompanied minor, this is a woman, and also taking care also of sort of cultural and religious considerations that migrants would come with. So I think it would be also interesting to hear whether some of these procedures, when we talk about them as procedures, how do they really rope in and take care of the migrant in front, or are procedures sort of also made in this securitization way that border management is sort of foreseen, is actually seen to be. And so by introduction, maybe let me just say that James is the head of advocacy and he's the legal advisor. As you could hear, he gave us a lot of, he already touched on to the legal aspects there. And he was admitted as an attorney in 2008. And he has, where he was a law student, and since then he has continuously been working, providing legal advice and assistance in human rights, particularly in refugee and migrant law sector, from the University of Cape Town Refugee Rights Unit, and several other places, including Scalabrini's Institute for Human Mobility in Africa. And now he's heading the advocacy and legal advice team at Scalabrini Center of Cape Town. He's passionate about consulting and advising clients, providing advocacy training and teaching, and particularly in working in refugee and migration law. He has a keen grasp of quite a number of issues that also look at migration detention, which is particularly important when we talk about border management related issues as well, refugee status, appeals, litigation issues, and all this in pursuit of dignity and equality for migrants. So James, as we just bring you in, and I know I've asked you like a handful of questions, but that's the idea with these discussions, sort of we try to just unpack, and you help us make sense out of this, this objective and this setting, to understand really, does it speak into the reality where you are sitting? And so in addition to the other question, maybe as you come back in on this one, what do you sort of see as the format of the linkages between the GCM objectives? I know you touched on legal pathways and the vulnerabilities, and how does that then impact on the work of civil society organizations, particularly looking at the work that you're doing as Scalabrini as a faith-based organization? James.
I beg your pardon. All right. So thank you very much for that, Patty. So yeah, and perhaps Kuda will also come in a little bit on these questions. But look, the work of the Scalabrini Center, it's very hands-on. It's very, for the most part, particularly in terms of our paralegal work and our engagement with clients, it's at sort of, I guess, grassroots or the coal face, as it were. in terms of like you do get steps in the right direction in terms of gender sensitivity. I mean, sort of inclusion and understanding, child sensitive processes. We don't have, I would say, maybe the degree of certainty and predictability that one would want. One of the big challenges is that for the longest time, the only option for many was to go onto the asylum or refugee documentation, because there were next to no kind of provision for low skilled work or business, and then you had your special permit procedures coming in, and it's also important to look at what happened in the context of COVID, because the procedure and the provision for people on the move wasn't extended to a lot when it came to, for example, the relief from distress grants, until Scalabrini Center intervened and said, well, while you're making provision for South Africans and for recognized refugees, what about the plethora of asylum seekers? What about special permit holders who are also suffering to a large extent because of the pandemic? And so as a result of intervention and litigation, there was an extension of the provision of relief by the government for those particular groupings. In terms of, there have also been a sort of a series of blanket extensions across the board for people on the move, in terms of processing, the processing of visas, the processing of asylum and refugee documentation, special permits. It's all almost sort of held in abeyance by the pandemic, with offices not being accessible, and so there has been a sort of a real shift in the procedure and the assessment, and these almost sort of amnesty and provision for people who hold various migratory groups, various document holders to accept as legal tenure documents beyond their expiration, which is a very, very positive thing. One of the difficulties also encountered is there's been as I mentioned, the processing at the borders and the fence, but also there's been an increased sort of more heavy-handedness at the borders and processing people in a less sort of humane and dignified manner, and that's something that has come up fairly recently, particularly with the Zimbabwe-South Africa border. We see also, I mean, things like where there's an amendment to the Citizenship Act back in 2013, providing for individuals who are born in South Africa to migrant parents being able to apply for citizenship upon reaching majority, but no sort of clear procedures being put in place. And it's not just that. I mean, there need to be clearer operating procedures in place with respect to unaccompanied and separated children. We see that, I mean, through the courts some years ago already, there was this argument that you shouldn't document separated children until one has gone through a detailed court process, children's court inquiry process, which can take years. And the court found that, you know, the position of a child, irrespective of the circumstances, whether there's something untoward that happened or not, are better if you give them the dignity of documentation. You know, and that word dignity has come throughout our legislative framework. We see, for example, the right to work for asylum seekers, which could have mentioned, as I say, it seems to be the amendments aim to in some way detract from, was provided for, saying that, you know, a family needs to be able to work to support themselves, to feed themselves and their children as part of the fundamental human right to dignity, and without that, one doesn't have that protection. We also see processes that relate to detention and deportation, and situation in detention facilities also having changed, such that, I mean, there is at least better enforcement of the 48-hour rule since the 2017 LHR judgment. But you still see practices of people being held and detained in detention, in deportation designated sites, which now, as of late 2018, early 2019, includes practically every police station, every prison in the country is designated. And so you get people sometimes in a maximum security prison, their fault being that they're a migrant, not for any crime or otherwise. So yeah, I mean, I might be painting a fairly bleak picture, but just to say that there isn't like while we have what has been lauded as very progressive, very protecting, human rights protecting legislative framework, particularly in the refugee space, but also with respect to other migrant categories. Amendments together with policy and practice tell a different story. And so, yeah, in terms of the work that the Scalabrini Center is doing, yeah, it's extensive, trying to ensure that there is still dignity and rights realization for all people on the move. Sorry, Paddy, I think you might be on mute.
It was my turn to be on mute. Kuda, I thought that, maybe you want to come in and and maybe link to the previous question that we had on, your work, and particularly on your PhD, where you were sort of looking at this relationship. And I quite like how you've defined it, the time, space, and humanitarianism in the Zimbabwe South Africa border regime. And you kind of touch on different things. Now, how does that then link to kind of, when we talk about regularization of irregular migrants, and then maybe you tied on to some of the other vulnerabilities that we had outlined before as the question. So if you could tie these issues in that aspect.
Thanks a lot. I think I want to start with this COVID-19 context as well, because it's quite interesting. One of the issues, I think James was very comprehensive in the issues he touched on. The more direct one is the one sort of related to vaccines, where it's really tenuous as it stands around where undocumented migrants stand and where actually, if they're vaccinated, where they're getting it. In some cases that you do get sites that say they will vaccinate, but there's also a genuine lack of trust between migrant users, and also some of these centers where, the dangers of saying, this space is exclusively, or this time is exclusively for undocumented migrants, opens up in a context of xenophobic violence, which, I think I hope participants know that the South African context is also bereft or loaded with some of these violent attacks against migrants, creates all sorts of vulnerabilities related to physical harm. So I think this also opens up some of the questions around sort of exceptionalizing migrants and talking about migrant rights. What that kind of also does in a context like South Africa is, in as much as it opens up room for access to services, etc., it also risks putting them in the more further precarious position. And I think in our work as well, we've tried to really think through how one needs to be cautious or tread carefully around the kinds of sort of demands or about rights, rightly so, that they make, and how they frame some of those issues. So it's always been useful to try and sort of talk about, sort of when you're talking about this vaccines, maybe we talk about it as a public health issue, or we talk about it as an urban safety issue when we talk about the protection of migrants, particularly with the COVID-19 pandemic, which in some ways became the sort of boiling pot for the looting that took place in South Africa last year. I think we saw how actually, in actual fact, the warnings that the centers such as Scalabrini and ACMS have been putting out to say, you need to deal with this scourge, not necessarily because it victimizes migrants, but because you are bound to see at some point this transpire at the level of public order, safety, criminality, etc. So it's not necessarily just sort of like a red herring, or we're trying to pitch something in a particular way. It did, I think it did actually play out in reality, and this is the same situation that we also find when we have to talk about some of the issues that take place around the issues of humanitarian protection, which I think is happening as well, particularly at the border. So the border space, to return to this conversation about the crisis that I was talking about, around that same time, there was I think Chloe mentioned this idea of putting people in camps or shelters. We also find shelters that are sort of pseudo camps that are there in that particular space, in the sense of so these camps during the humanitarian crisis in Zimbabwe were opened up as a way to, because migrants were coming in and they didn't have anywhere to go, they would need somewhere to stay. So shelters, while their asylum applications were still being processed. And these spaces have always been contested, particularly at that time. The one issue that arose when the shelters, or at least when there was an informal kind of camp at the showgrounds in Musina at the Zimbabwe-South Africa border, was the issue of sanitation, safety, etc., and the numbers of people there. So this is when the religious, humanitarian, sort of religious actors, faith-based actors came in, and they then offered up these spaces to provide this shelter. And these spaces were made as a sort of uneasy compromise between municipality and the local faith-based organizations, together with Home Affairs, to say people can stay in these spaces for as long as they are applying for asylum. Initially, it was for 3 days, and then it became 2 weeks because of the bureaucratic red tape and the delays around this processing that took place. So over time, we're seeing how these spaces have, because Zimbabweans were actually applying for asylum at the time, or eligible in some way, or being, first of all, the one part is feeling welcome to do it, enough to trust that you can walk into a reception office and apply for that permit without being arrested or deported. Secondly, also knowing that we're actually seen by the state as that kind of a figure, which is not necessarily the case anymore, particularly right now, as well as the refugee reception offices themselves are closed have been closed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So this is a space now where we see people almost, I think the COVID just shows how the realities of people who were living already under this kind of harsh lockdown space has also kind of transpired broadly, or into society, because these are people who actually, the same model of giving relief grants and etc., are people who are actually relying on this on the day-to-day while they are staying in this particular shelters. But the categorization then comes into play, where, because Zimbabwean migrants, or we see, like, for example, at the shelter, like the men's shelter, where Zimbabwean migrants are staying with people from Burundi and DRC who are being serviced by your UNHCR implementing partners in terms of legal and social aid, not being necessarily able to access that similar aid. So it becomes a space where Zimbabwean migrants are staying and have to work to earn money to move forward into the interior. But it also becomes a complicated space in the context of the COVID pandemic, where because these people cannot access any kind of individualized care if they're not documented to be as people with asylum documents, for example, they would then also need to, the implementing partners would need to make a blanket assessment and mention and state that these are the reasons why they need to provide some kind of aid to these people. So in those cases, for example, last year, one of the implementing partners was able to make a blanket assessment and offer some kind of care and protection. So in terms of food, blankets, and I think transport money for people to move, because again, because of the COVID space, these spaces were now deemed unsafe, and the municipality again was contesting the space to say people need to come up with some kind of an exit plan or an exit strategy. So it's a very complicated space where these ideas and categories come into play, and people get excluded, and especially migrants who are not necessarily so much persons of concern are then left out. And then finally, maybe to mention how this idea of the categorization again of this vulnerability, how it then also becomes a question of not only migration, is how it has also become a debate in the South African space itself to say who should be getting this grant. So we see as a context where it's not only migrants whose issues are contested. There had to be also internally some conversations about how do we make sure that we extend this for the longest time. And there's also been cases of fraud and corruption where people even South African people don't get this grant. So one can imagine, if you're a migrant or if you're a refugee and you don't get it, what you actually have to do in those kinds of cases. So in short, I'm just trying to show sort of the interplay between some of these issues, that they're not necessarily just migration issues, and they're not necessarily just issues of the state. Humanitarian or non-governmental actors can also be somewhat, particularly as been mentioned, the space is shrinking, funding is shrinking. There are different ways in which people or different actors come together as well to manage these, or to at least govern these groups in different ways, so much that their position doesn't necessarily improve. It just becomes sort of the standard Zimbabwean way of life in South Africa.
Thank you, Kuda, for zooming into those issues. I think you've brought out a lot of interesting aspects there as well. I think this also the use of sort of the migrants as a target, if you like, for political reasons, as a political scapegoat for some of the social problems that may be at home, and where, whether citizens feel justified or not. And I think, globally, one of the examples that sits with us, and today we see what the consequences are like, is Brexit, isn't it? Where it was as though, all these migrants who came and they took all these jobs. And then once that space has opened, we begin to see actually other issues that were really there, and other issues that needed to be addressed. And of course, that's a different space altogether. But I think that there's a lot of lessons that can kind of also be picked in how the space for misinformation, that the fact that migration data or migration statistics, or the fact that you have migrants participating in the labor market, migrants that have been welcomed to seek asylum in a particular country, refugee camps that have been opened in particular in certain countries, urban refugees that are living within urban spaces, allowed to live with the community, how there needs to be a preparation for the people. And I like how you said it, that all these things are existing in already maybe a contentious environment. So how do we make sure that when we're even taking care of migrants' needs, that we don't put them at risk of being unwelcome by the community that should actually be welcoming them. So thank you for raising some of those issues. We'll move to the Q&A, and I will start off by a question that we have seen from Waiswa Jacob, and this question is going to Chloe, and it's asking about the major patterns of migrants who go to Greece, and also trying to understand, are they in transit or are they stayers, and using the experience of Greece, what is the future of migration? Is it simply irresistible, no matter the barriers the destination countries put in place? So I think that's an interesting question. Waiswa, if you would like to speak, you can go ahead. Otherwise, we'll ask Chloe to go ahead and answer that question in a moment. We also have other questions in the chat, but usually we would like to just hear people. So maybe, Chloe, you'll be the first to go in a moment, but do we just please raise your hand as per usual. It would be nice to hear some different voices as well. I also see Dr. Raj is here with us from GRFDT. Dr. Raj, you're welcome to also share with us your reflections on the Global Compact for Migration, two objectives, the two objectives that we are touching on today. We are glad that you are here and you have joined us. Dr. Raj, would you like to share some reflections as we wait for some hands to come up?
Okay.
I think you need.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the presenters. Very interesting presentations. So I don't want to waste time on congratulating the speakers, but I want to go straight into what I have in my mind. On the one hand, we have the GCM, safe, regular, and whatever orderly migration. On the other hand, very limited pathways for migrants or would-be migrants to tap on. And in fact, increasingly restricting those pathways. For example, closing down access sites where they could apply, whether it's asylum or whatever. Now, the couple of points that I have in mind is that in the reality of, this is a reality, and increasingly receiving countries are looking for innovative ways to put more blocks in the ways of migrants who are attempting to cross, whichever, whether it's in southern Zimbabwe, South Africa, or whether it's from where to Europe. So who's benefiting is the migration industry, the burgeoning migration industry on the backs of the poor migrants. Okay, so in other words, out of desperation, migrants will resort to, and I'll give you an example of a very short, brief survey or field work I did in Johannesburg a few years ago among migrants from Zimbabwe who can come as visitors, as tourists into South Africa, and they get a period of 6 months, if I'm not wrong. And they are in the service industries like domestic, childcare, restaurant industry, and so on. After that, somehow they managed to get some sort of work permit, and this is due to corruption. Now the work permits are also being manufactured or printed by, that's the other industry, the migration industry. The few people, 20 people I interviewed, after their 6-month period was finishing, they went to this whoever, and I don't want to name, they got the thing with the government stamp on it to issue work permit. Now for those who, and you have to pay X number, I don't know, $100 or $200 to get that fake work permit, and nobody's looking at the stamp. Okay, fine, you're regular, you stay on, okay, for a year. And then you have to exit. So what they're doing, but that's with the land, not with the air. So they're putting $100, $200 in their passport and give to the driver from South Africa side who's going into Zimbabwe, or the Zimbabwe side coming into South Africa. So there's mutual corruption. So you give some to the driver who takes your passport into Zimbabwe to have it stamped that you exited, right? And bring it back and give it to you. And then the South African guy who lets you come in also gets some money. So we have this, in other words, the migration industry is becoming very creative. So the point I'm making is that out of desperation, people will do whatever it takes to do, to make sure that if they don't get opportunities at home, they will have to look for them elsewhere. Now, is that safe? Is it, the violation of their rights and so on? Now, these are the realities. I mean, this is just few people, 20 people, but I mean, there are lots of things happening at the border, especially the land border. So the question I have, how do we reconcile this contradiction? Is it just on paper that we should have safe, regular migration? In reality, the pathways are not there and people are just fending for themselves and putting themselves into harm, right? Harm way, whether they lose their lives or whether they lose their precious resources. So this is the question I have. How do we reconcile? And now there is the review going to be taking place in May, in a few months' time. How do we relay this? These are the realities on the ground. We can talk about and make declarations and sign documents, but this is not the reality. And a lot of things are happening. And I think rather than shutting down, there have to be another ways of allowing people where there's demand. And there's demand for low-skilled labor in most countries where the economies are doing well. South Africa, there's demand for domestics, there's demand for low skill in the hotel, in the service industry. So how do we, in other words, there is demand. These are the sectors. It might be very harsh to then accept for these receiving countries to say, yes, you know what, we have got demand for unskilled people, but we are not going to legally let them in, let them find their own way. So how do we convey this? This is a contradiction. Whether it's at the US-Mexican border, or whether it's Zimbabwe, South Africa, or whether it's some other countries. These are the realities. Sorry, Paddy, taken too much time.
Perfect timing, no problem. Thank you, Dr. Raj, for those reflections. Mr. Ngozi, you're welcome. Please share your reflections or your question.
Yeah, I think it's more of reflection than question. Vanyaro, what of if government or those NGOs use quota system to deliver good practices to the host to the refugees and host communities? Like the little work I do here in my little part of Nigeria, the CUSO and the UNHCR, in collaboration with the local NGO, they have a fish pond for the refugees. And in that fish pond, there are 70%, 30% quota between the refugees and communities. And this has, this has built up harmony between the two groups. So can this thing be replicated in your place in South Africa? Thank you. And there is another question on data, which I put on the chart, on the ethical and the practical impact of using data to target humanitarian and aids on those on the move. I think won't it jeopardize their rights? Thank you.
Thank you, Ngozi, for that question. And so maybe we can make a round of questions. We just have the panelists. Just feel free to see which questions. Justin, please go ahead. You are welcome to speak.
Thank you for everything.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Justin, we seem to have not to be having your audio. Are you able to write your question?
I wanted
okay,
to,
there, you
I
are
wanted
back.
to ask
Good.
about that term every time in South Africa. Sometimes is
Justin, we're missing your question. I think your connection is breaking. Would you mind to send your question in the chat?
okay.
Thank you. All right. So maybe Chloe, do you want to kick us off with some of the responses? I know we also have some questions in the chat. So please, Kuda, James, Chloe, just feel free to look in there. And if you would like to share some reflections, shall I say we give each of you at least 2 minutes to give some responses before we will be wrapping up?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can start with the question that was in the chat specifically on Greece. So in terms of people that are coming through, it's very mixed. There's, for now, a large population coming from Afghanistan, but historically also there's many people from Syria, from Kurdistan, from Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan that have transited through Greece, in addition to people from the DRC, Somalia, Eritrea, and other parts of Northern Africa, the Maghreb, and it's something where I think very few people want to stay. It's a lot of the Balkans and in Greece are, in many people's minds, I think, still spaces of transit or a first entry point, whereas the final destination might be Northern or Western Europe. This being said, the reality is many people are winding up stuck or will reach Greece and then are unable to continue on for a host of reasons, which has led to huge populations of people that are now kind of going through the asylum procedure in Greece, and in the last years have done so. In terms of lessons to be learned with regards to migration, and I can speak more for the European context, I think one thing that the last 5 years, 10 years in the Balkans has shown is that regardless of the kinds of barriers put in people's way, people will still try to go and reach the places in which they would like to be. And the fact of like the increasing militarization and securitization of borders, as what we're seeing in the Balkans and Greece at the moment, has meant that people are taking more dangerous paths, that people are relying more heavily on smuggling networks, and the risk of trafficking is much higher, rather than actually stopping people from transiting in the first place. And so it's this paradox, right, where in theory, state is looking to reduce migration. In practice, it's still happening, but more people are dying on the way, or more people are put in situations that are incredibly dangerous along the routes. And I think in terms of lessons to be learned from this, it's kind of it's clear, I think, from the example of the Balkans, that it's just creating more barriers to mobility doesn't actually change people's desire to move. And there's other kind of solutions that would be needed in terms of addressing maybe the root causes of migration, maybe ways to support people once they're in the country to integrate, to kind of have access to state services, and to be able to continue on to the spaces in which they are choosing to do. So this, just to keep it short.
Thanks, Chloe. Joanne Gloria, I see that you are there, and instinctively I was thinking about you. So please go ahead and just share with us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Badi. Thank you, our speakers today. This is a very relevant topic on how we can see on how to manage the issues of migration if we check on our borders. I would only want to pose, I don't know if it's a comment or rather a reflection or a question. The issue of undocumented migrant workers in the receiving countries, could we say that probably the cause could be the issue of unmanaged borders? Because if we are able to have migrants who are documented or who are undocumented, sometimes back we studied about the missing migrants that we were not sure where they are in the destination countries. Could we say it is probably brought up by the issue of unmanaged borders? That is my thought or my question. Thank you very much.
That's an interesting one. Thanks, Joan Gloria. Good to see you. Kuda, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. I think I want to go in because most of what the question is all links back into this train of thought, I think, which will allow us to unravel this or try to settle this somewhat. So this idea of, I think Dr. Raj mentioned something interesting about, the disparity between safe, orderly migration and also between the migration industry and exploitation and other things, even this idea of sort of missing migrants, right? So I think the conversation needs to be more one that allows us to talk about some of the costs related to this, which is, I think, the issue that Chloe mentioned around, I think if taxpayers knew how much is being spent on in South Africa, in the Southern African region, they call it the revolving door of the deportation system, in which people only just come back after being, deported, and that's Lindela is a cash cow, and a lot of corruption happens there. So there could be ways of trying to frame these issues within the broader sort of governance questions. But I think also to show to states that managing borders effectively does not necessarily mean barring movement. So that's where I think the question that you just asked, Joanne, around whether the problem is, I think, how managing borders is interpreted, which is not necessarily how it should be. You know, you wouldn't be having missing migrants who are not known if the borders were, if you facilitated pathways or legal pathways, if you gave people documentation, you would know who the people who are in your country are, and you wouldn't be having issues of, even if you're criminalizing migrants, certainly not helping yourself by closing borders or forcing them into going underground. You'd rather, facilitate movement and make sure you see them and know and visibilize them so much you can be able to also detect and monitor and retain and also locate them when you need them, for anything, even if it's to deport people for violating immigration legislation. So I think that's how everything kind of comes together. Currently, it's the interpretation and also the governance. This discussion needs to be a broader sort of question of governance, not necessarily a silo of let's just keep migrants out.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kuda. James?
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Sorry, I'm mindful of time because I feel we might have gone a little bit over. So there was a question in relation to, the management and coordination might be towards ensuring that stolen documents aren't used, criminality and trafficking, but then how do we still ensure that the rights of people on the move are safeguarded, albeit that, one might want to prevent any criminality. These things are not mutually exclusive. While people need to be maybe processed in a safe and orderly manner, it doesn't detract or take away from the humanity of all individuals, and that is required because at best you've still got to ensure that fair trial rights, equality, dignity, and life are provided to criminal elements. And at worst, you will end up then having, lumping everybody together, and those that are particularly vulnerable, who are not complicit in such dealings, which is by and large a majority, is taken down with it if you don't act correctly. So due process, fair trial rights, administrative justice, equality, dignity, these sort of constitutional rights, the protection against being referred, non-penalization of illegal entry and presence in terms of the 1951 Convention, the right to life and preventing somebody being returned to a place where they might face a death penalty, all these kind of things. There's a Tsebe case that is authority for that. All these kind of things ensure that you safeguard and protect the rights of people on the move, and you can still sort of maintaining an orderly migratory process. And that also if you talk to the entry, detention, deportation procedures. One of the important things also to do to ensure rights protection is to genuinely and properly engage with the government, ensure compliance with obligations, but also try to enhance and increase the protection space. Just coming to something that Kuda said about undocumented, there's definitely a lack of trust, but the public health system would completely cease to function if people were at risk of being reported to the government Department of Home Affairs or the equivalent Interior Affairs if they went to go get a vaccine. So South Africa has quite impressively, I think, as of sort of October, November last year, rolled out the vaccination for people living on the street, coupled with people who are undocumented migrants, which is also in some ways kind of helpful because then it's not sort of simplifying to one particular grouping. And then there's procedures in place in relation to unaccompanied children need to be enhanced and improved. There was a question about how do we reconcile, and the best way that I can see to sort of reconcile the need for safe and orderly migration and the fact that there is this kind of no option but to go this roundabout route because you can't regularize, is to actually push for, advocate for, and ensure that our governments, in paying proper respect to the compact, ensure that they make mechanisms available and permits and options available, so that the mixed migration flows all have pathways, genuine, clear, and good pathways to take, such that it doesn't result in a sort of a hopeless situation where one can only but go irregular and sometimes criminal routes, like the example that was given of going to get paying an official to extend the document. And we've seen it like in the South African context of the Zimbabwean special permits, the Lesotho special permits, and the promise to extend that for Malawi nationals as well. And I mean, not forgetting what Paddy was talking to, and it's very true, in East Africa, in ECOWAS, there are other places with best practices that we need to draw from and ensure that we have better, freer movement and better pathways provided for people on the move.
Thank you, James. I also see that we have Professor Binod Kadria with us, who is the president of GRFDT. Professor Binod, did you want to share with us some reflections for about 2 minutes?
Thank you, Paddy. Thank you, and it has been very, very engaging session, and I would have restrained myself in the interest of time, but the last few comments have been really, really very provocative and to the point. Both Kudawaske and James, I have pronounced Kudawaske's name properly. I think the question of right and dignity are mutually, interrelated and absolutely important. And I just want to refer to that. It is not only the, poor and the downtrodden people who are, the injustices and their rights are taken away, but also the high and mighty, because we have this issue of Novak Djokovic, the tennis star, being deported even after the courts intervened, and then it was going into the second hearing and second incident because he refused to be vaccinated. That right is something which is supreme in the context that, just at this same moment, the India Supreme Court of India asked the Indian government whether it has been making it mandatory for people to be vaccinated if they have to be traveling. And the answer given by the Indian government, and I'm going to quote here, it says no person can be forcibly vaccinated without consent. The government has not made carrying vaccine certificate mandatory for any purpose. This is the Indian government telling the Supreme Court. Now, this is the crux of what James had said and other people in this session has mentioned, that it is universal dignity, it is universal right of the individual and not of clubbing them, putting them together as herds, at people of, in a group of that kind, orderly fashion, that people are put together to migrate in an orderly fashion. That, I think, is absolutely bottom line that we need to focus our attention to. Thank you for this opportunity.
Professor Kadria, thank you for coming in with those reflections. And once again, we want to say thank you to our panelists. I think we had a question which I think we should all go back with. We do know that the IMRF, so the review forum for, that has been talked about with all the Global Compact for Migration reviews having taken place. And that all comes to a fold, or a height rather, in May this year. And so, with that in mind, a lot of us have been thinking, suppose we had a chance to rewrite, using the experiences that we've had, whether it's COVID, whether it's national experiences, whether it's experiences at the regional and the global level, individual experiences, and being very sincere on what we want to see, apart from the disconnect, apart from those who are unwilling, as we have heard today, sometimes from political systems, as those, as also in terms of also what is needed in terms of humanitarian needs that migrants may need, and sometimes just simply opening up of the space so that migrants may be able to engage and have dignified experiences with migration. If we think about all those things, what would we consider to change with these two objectives? So maybe we would leave with that question for ourselves, and not just to hand it over to our panelists, but really in thinking about how we're reshaping and reforming the kind of global frameworks that we want to see. How do we contribute to those conversations as civil society, as researchers, as those who are working on the front lines, as our panelists have outlined and have shown us from their experience and from their advocacy work. And we're really grateful that we've had that opportunity to unpack these two global compact for migration objectives centered around managing borders, as well as looking at procedures for referral and screening. And so with that, we just want to say thank you very much for your attention. We realize we're 10 minutes over time. Thank you again to all the panelists. Kuda, thanks a lot, always, and James as well, for always just being able to pick up when we look out for you. I think we will now consider you as friends of GRFDT. And also for Chloe, our new friend for GRFDT, and friends of all the organizations that are represented as organizers for this course. We're really grateful that you could take your time to share with our students. To all the students, over 100 plus, were with us today. Thank you for being with us, and we'll be sharing this recording with those who were not still able to catch up so that they may. And as usual, we thank you for your active participation. We look forward to seeing you for the Global Compact for Migration webinar series next week on Tuesday. And we'll be looking at alternatives to detention, to migration detention, another very touching and difficult topic, but that needs unpacking for us to understand what needs to get done. And on Saturday, as usual, we have the lecture series. And for this particular Saturday, we're asking our students, as you are joining us to discuss national policies and regional migration mechanisms, we would actually like to hear from you, because everybody is coming from a country where there's a national policy, and that national policy is probably embedded somewhere in a regional mechanism. So we would like for you to participate actively to this session and facilitate as well as listening to the lecture that will be presented. So see you on Saturday, and for all our friends and followers, we'll see you next Tuesday. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you. I just want to say to James that we have great connections, long-term connections with Scalabrini Center. I have had Graziano Battistella, had Fabio Baggio and Marwa Assis in Manila, who is the editor of the APMG, are all friends. So you are in good company, and we are very glad to see you today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the participants. Wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks again, James.
Thank you, Patty.
Thank you. Thanks, Joan, Gloria. Thanks.
Thanks,
Grace, thank you for being here.
bye. Thanks.
Mr. Justin, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Professor Vinod, thank you.